On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday kicked off the stock market crash. Stock prices fell 11%, and Wall Street bankers bought stocks so only 2% was lost by the time the market closed. On October 29th, the market lost another 12% as a record of 16 million shares were traded. When banks intervened this time, they worsened the panic. The stock market would not return to its pre crash high for the next 25 years. In 1930, amid one of the Depression's many false hopes, President Herbert Hoover reassured an audience that the Depression is over. But the president was not simply guilty of false optimism. Hoover made many mistakes. During his 1928 election campaign, Hoover promoted higher tariffs as a means for encouraging domestic consumption and protecting American farmers from foreign competition. Spurred by the ongoing agricultural depression, Hoover signed into law the highest tariff in American history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, just as global markets began to crumble. Tariff walls rose across the globe and international trade ground to a halt. Between 1929 and 1932, international trade dropped from $36 billion to only $12 billion. American exports fell by 78%. And combined with overproduction and declining domestic consumption, the tariff exacerbated the world's economic collapse. January 1932, Congress created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend $2 billion to financial institutions to prevent further failures. In July, Congress authorized it to lend money to states for relief. June 6, Hoover signed the Revenue Act of 1932. It increased the top income tax rate to 63%. He wanted to reduce the federal deficit, and Hoover believed it would also restore confidence. Instead, higher taxes worsened the Depression. Numbers soon proved the optimists incorrect. The Depression steadily worsened. By spring of 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office, unemployment had risen from 8 to 15 million. 40% of the farms in Mississippi were on the auction block on FDR's inauguration day. Although the Depression was worldwide, no other country except Germany reached so high a percentage of unemployment, and the poor were hit the hardest. The New Deal was enacted from 1933 to 1939 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to provide immediate economic relief from the Great Depression and to address necessary reforms in industry, agriculture, finance, water power, labor, and housing. The New Deal was grounded in the belief that the power of the federal government was needed to lift America from the Great Depression. These programs signaled both an expansion of federal power and a transformation in the relationship between the federal government and the American people. Many of the New Deal policies were enacted in the first 3 months of President Roosevelt's time in office, which became known as the first 100 days. Roosevelt's first objective was to address widespread unemployment by establishing agencies such as Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Such agencies dispensed emergency and short-term government aid and provided temporary jobs such as work on construction projects and national forests. In 1935, hoping to reconstitute some of the protections afforded workers in the now defunct NRA, Roosevelt worked with Congress to pass the National Labor Relations Act, offering federal legal protection for the first time for workers to organize unions. 3 years later, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, creating the modern minimum wage. The Second New Deal also oversaw the restoration of a highly progressive federal income tax, mandated new reporting requirements for the publicly traded companies, refinanced long-term home mortgages for struggling homeowners, and attempted rural reconstruction projects to bring farm incomes in line with the urban ones. In addition, one of the most notable New Deal programs, the Social Security Board, was enacted in 1935 and 1939, providing benefits to the elderly and to widows, unemployment compensation, and disability insurance. In the South, as the Depression worsened across the United States in 1931 and 1932, Texans eventually had to recognize its existence, and they attempted to combat its devastating effects. Since the Hoover administration seemed incapable of meeting the people's needs, private charities shouldered the burdens of the poor and desperate until funds were exhausted, whereupon city governments and community leaders intervened. In rural Texas, economic conditions during 1931 and 1932 also deteriorated, but farmers, many of whom were sharecroppers and tenants, were already accustomed to some poverty and therefore did not always realize the degrees of hardship. Consequently, Texans sought new solutions to their problems. President Hoover, whom they had ardently supported for over 2 years, was now a villain of huge proportions, a betrayer of capitalism and democracy, and the man who was responsible for their economic calamity. So when Democrats nominated Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt of New York for president and John Nance Garner of Uvalde for vice president in the summer of 1932, the election choice was evident. Texans agreed that a new deal for the forgotten man required their backing. The Democratic ticket garnered 88.6% of the state vote. Residents of the state, hoping for immediate returns on their political decisions, were not disappointed. World War II played only a modest role in the recovery of the U.S. economy. Despite the recession of 1937 to 1938, by 1941 the economy had recovered to within about 10% of its long-run trend path. At the same time, the U.S. economy was still somewhat below trend at the start of the war, and the unemployment rate averaged just under 10% in 1941. The government budget deficit grew rapidly in 1941 and 1942 because of the military buildup, and the Federal Reserve responded to the threat and later the reality of war by increasing the money supply greatly over the same period. This expansionary fiscal and monetary policy quickly returned the economy to its trend path and reduced the unemployment rate to below its pre-depression level.